Margaret Harrington did not lower her voice when she said it. The room was quiet enough that every glass on the long oak table seemed to hold the words. "You should understand something, Veronica," she said calmly. "When this divorce is over, you'll leave with nothing." Several people looked down. No one corrected her. Philip Harrington stared at the legal papers in front of him as if silence could soften the sentence. Veronica Stanfield did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply watched Margaret with the same steady expression she had worn for years. Margaret believed the prenup protected her family. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the prenup had been Veronica's idea. And Veronica had read every line of it. Before the story continues, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this unfold slowly, and every detail matters. If you believe quiet strength often speaks louder than anger, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the rest of what happened next. Long before anyone in the Harrington family believed they understood Veronica Stanfield, she had already learned the quiet discipline of watching people reveal themselves. She had grown up in a modest house outside Portland, Oregon, where money was never abundant, but clarity was. Her father had been an accountant for a small construction firm. Her mother taught literature at a public high school. Neither of them had ever pretended wealth meant wisdom. What shaped Veronica more than anything, however, was something that happened when she was 17. Her uncle's divorce had torn through the family like a storm. 2 years of legal arguments, accusations about hidden money, disputed property, and endless documents had followed. Veronica remembered sitting at the kitchen table late at night while her father tried to explain why contracts mattered more than promises once relationships broke apart. "People believe love protects them," he had said quietly while flipping through a stack of legal papers. "But when things fall apart, paper is what decides the truth." That sentence stayed with her long after the divorce was finalized. It was one of the reasons she chose to study finance. At the University of Washington, Veronica discovered she had an unusual patience for numbers and structure. While others rushed through spreadsheets, she studied patterns, risk, discrepancies, the invisible story behind transactions. After graduating, she moved to Chicago and accepted a position as a risk analyst for a mid-sized financial advisory firm. The work required attention to detail most people found exhausting. Veronica found it calming. Her colleagues often joked that she noticed things others missed. Small inconsistencies, slight changes in tone during meetings, emails that seemed harmless until placed beside the right numbers. She rarely spoke during meetings unless she was certain of what she was about to say. When she did speak, people listened. By the time she was 31, she had built a quiet reputation inside the firm for something unusual she was almost impossible to surprise. Philip Harrington, however, managed to do exactly that. They met at a financial compliance conference in Boston. Philip was speaking on a panel about family investment offices structures used by wealthy families to manage generational wealth. His presentation was confident, but not arrogant. Unlike many heirs who appeared at those events, he seemed genuinely interested in the mechanics of finance rather than the prestige attached to it. After the panel ended, a small group gathered near the coffee station to continue the conversation. Philip noticed Veronica listening more than speaking. "Do you work in compliance?" he asked. "Risk analysis," she replied. "That explains the expression," he said with a smile. "You look like you're evaluating whether anything I said was actually accurate." Veronica allowed herself a small smile. "I'm still deciding." Philip laughed easily, the kind of laugh that made people comfortable. There was a warmth in him that didn't seem rehearsed. Over the next hour, then they talked about markets regulation and the strange psychology of wealth. Philip surprised her more than once with thoughtful questions. He was intelligent. But there was something else Veronica noticed. Philip had lived his entire life inside a structure built long before he was born. The Harrington family was well known in certain financial circles. Harrington Capital Group had been founded by Philip's grandfather in the late 1970s and had grown into a large investment firm managing real estate portfolios, private equity, and several hedge funds. Generational wealth had a way of shaping people's expectations. Philip seemed aware of that. "I spend most of my time proving I'm not just inheriting something," he admitted during their conversation. "Are you?" Veronica asked calmly. He paused before answering. "I'm trying not to." That honesty was rare enough that Veronica remembered it. Their first dinner happened 3 weeks later in Chicago. Philip happened to be in the city for meetings and suggested they continue the conversation. What began as a discussion about markets turned into something else entirely. Philip spoke about growing up in New York, about boarding schools, long summers in the Hamptons, and family expectations that arrived long before adulthood. Veronica spoke about Oregon, about practical parents who believed in financial independence more than social status. They were different in ways that made their conversations unexpectedly balanced. Philip brought energy. Veronica brought clarity. Over the next year, their relationship deepened steadily. Philip visited Chicago frequently. Veronica occasionally traveled to New York. Eventually, she met Philip's parents. The first meeting took place in the Harrington townhouse on the Upper East Side. It was the kind of house that appeared in architecture magazines, 5 stories of restored brownstone antique furniture and quiet staff moving through the rooms with practiced discretion. Margaret Harrington greeted Veronica with a smile that was perfectly measured. She was elegant, composed, and known in New York society for her ability to host events where business and reputation intertwined seamlessly. Her reputation preceded her. Margaret had spent decades helping shape Harrington Capital's social network, politicians, donors, investors, and board members who moved comfortably through the same rooms. She shook Veronica's hand gently. "So you're the young woman Philip keeps mentioning." Her voice carried warmth, but her eyes studied carefully. Margaret had learned long ago how to evaluate people quickly. Veronica noticed the evaluation immediately. Philip's father, Charles Harrington, was quieter. He greeted Veronica politely and asked a few questions about her work. Unlike his wife, Charles seemed less interested in forming immediate conclusions. Dinner that evening was pleasant on the surface. Conversation flowed easily across topics: markets, travel, philanthropy. Margaret listened more than she spoke. But Veronica noticed something subtle. Margaret's questions were never random. Where did Veronica grow up? What did her parents do? Did she intend to continue working long term? Each question arrived casually, but together they formed a quiet assessment. Margaret Harrington was not simply making conversation. She was measuring. Philip did not seem to notice, or perhaps he had simply grown accustomed to it. When dinner ended, Margaret walked Veronica to the front hallway. "You're very thoughtful," she said politely while Philip retrieved their coats. "Thank you," Veronica replied. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "It's refreshing to meet someone who understands numbers. Too many people are impressed by wealth without understanding how fragile it can be." Veronica nodded. "That's true." Margaret held her gaze a moment longer. "Families like ours survive by being careful." The sentence sounded like advice. But Veronica recognized something else beneath it. A warning, not an unfriendly one. Just a statement of how the Harrington world operated. Veronica understood it clearly. Structures protected themselves, and families built on money were often the most structured of all. Philip proposed 6 months later during a quiet weekend trip to Vermont. He expected excitement. Veronica surprised him with a question. "Philip, before we get married, there's something I think we should do." "What's that?" he asked. "A prenup." Philip blinked in surprise. Veronica spoke calmly. "It protects both of us." Philip stared at her for a moment before laughing softly. "I think you're the first person in history to suggest that before my mother did." Veronica didn't laugh. She simply watched him. Philip didn't realize it then, but that moment would eventually become the detail that changed everything. Because when Margaret Harrington later spoke with such certainty about the prenup protecting her family, she believed it had been designed for that purpose. What she never suspected was that Veronica Stanfield had studied every word of that agreement long before the wedding ever happened. And she had asked for it. When Veronica Stanfield suggested the prenup, Philip Harrington initially assumed she was joking. They were sitting on the balcony of a quiet inn in Vermont, the early autumn air sharp with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Philip had just finished explaining with the nervous enthusiasm of someone unused to vulnerability how he had planned the proposal for weeks. Veronica listened patiently. When he finished, she said the word that surprised him: prenup. Philip leaned back in his chair, studying her expression to see if she was teasing him. "You realize," he said slowly, "that you're saying the thing most people wait for my mother to demand." "I know. You're serious." "Yes." Philip was quiet for a moment. Most people in his world reacted to money one of two ways. Either they were fascinated by it, or they tried to pretend it didn't matter. Veronica did neither. She spoke about it the same way she spoke about risk assessments at work, calmly, without emotion, as if money were simply another structure that needed to be examined carefully. "It isn't about protecting wealth," she explained. "It's about clarity." Philip folded his arms. "Clarity about what? About expectations." Veronica said, "Marriage is one kind of agreement. Financial partnership is another. Most people blend them together and hope nothing goes wrong." "And you don't believe in hoping?" Veronica gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I work in risk analysis." Philip laughed quietly. "Fair point." But the more they talked, the more Philip realized she wasn't approaching the conversation with suspicion. She was approaching it with discipline. "I've seen what happens when money becomes the weapon people use after a relationship breaks down," she continued. "Arguments about who owns what, accusations about hidden accounts, years of legal fighting." Philip looked out over the dark outline of the mountains. "My family has lawyers for that." "That's exactly my point," Veronica replied gently. He turned back toward her. "A prenup forces everything into the open before the marriage begins," she said. "Assets, expectations, financial responsibilities. If everything is clear from the start, there's less room for people to manipulate things later." Philip studied her face carefully. "You're not worried about protecting yourself?" Veronica shook her head slightly. "I'm worried about protecting the structure." That answer stayed with him longer than he expected. 2 weeks later, Philip brought the subject up with his parents during dinner at the Harrington townhouse. Margaret Harrington listened carefully without interrupting. Charles Harrington continued cutting his steak with quiet precision. When Philip finished explaining that Veronica herself had proposed the idea, Margaret finally set down her fork. "That's unusual," she said. Philip shrugged. "She works in financial risk analysis. She thinks in contracts." Margaret's eyes moved thoughtfully, and she suggested it before anyone asked yes. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Most women who entered wealthy families tried to avoid conversations about prenups. They feared it implied mistrust. Veronica Stanfield apparently had walked directly into the topic. That alone made Margaret curious. "Very well," Margaret said calmly. "If she values clarity, I suppose we can provide it." She turned slightly toward Charles. Gregory should handle the agreement. Gregory Holt had been the Harrington family's legal advisor for nearly 20 years. He was precise, experienced, and well acquainted with the complex structures wealthy families use to protect generational assets. Philip relayed the decision to Veronica the following evening. "Gregory Holt will draft the agreement," he explained. "He's worked with my family forever." Veronica nodded. "That makes sense. Most people would want their own lawyer involved," Philip added. "I will," Veronica said. Philip looked mildly relieved. Gregory Holt began drafting the agreement within the week. The document that arrived was thick dozens of pages outlining asset protections, definitions of marital property, and financial responsibilities under various hypothetical circumstances. Philip skimmed the first several pages before setting it aside. Veronica did not skim. She read, carefully, every clause, every cross-reference, every definition. Sometimes she would pause, write a small note in the margin of her copy, and continue. When she finished the first reading, she opened her laptop and began drafting a list of questions. Not objections, questions. Her lawyer at the time, Ethan Caldwell, a financial attorney she had occasionally worked with, professionally reviewed the document with her over 2 meetings. "It's thorough," Ethan admitted. But Veronica asked. "There are always assumptions built into documents like this," he said. "What kind of assumptions? That everyone involved will act honestly about their finances." Veronica nodded slowly. "And if they don't," Ethan gave a faint smile, "then documentation becomes very important." Veronica had expected that answer. Over the following weeks, she responded to Gregory Holt's draft through email. Each response was precise, polite, structured. She asked for clarification on certain clauses. She requested small wording adjustments regarding financial disclosure obligations. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. But each change reinforced the same principal: transparency. Gregory Holt approved most of the revisions without objection. From his perspective, Veronica appeared organized and cautious traits he respected in financial matters. Margaret Harrington, meanwhile, watched the process from a distance. She reviewed summaries Gregory provided. The agreement protected Harrington family assets thoroughly. That was the primary goal. Everything else seemed procedural. What Margaret did not notice was something Veronica did quietly during that entire process. She archived every email, every version of the agreement, every clarification Gregory sent, every line confirming who had proposed which ideas. Philip occasionally teased her about it. "You treat documents like they're historical artifacts," he said once. "They are," Veronica replied calmly. He laughed. "You really think anyone will care about this in 10 years? Veronica closed the folder she had been organizing. Probably not. Philip leaned against the kitchen counter. "Then why keep everything?" Veronica hesitated before answering. "Because memory changes," she said softly. "Documents don't." Philip shrugged. "Fair enough." The prenup was finalized 3 months before the wedding. On the day it was signed, everyone appeared satisfied. Gregory Holt confirmed the agreement was legally sound. Philip signed without hesitation. Veronica signed after one final careful review. Margaret Harrington felt reassured. The structure was secure. The Harrington family's assets were protected. What she believed was simple. If the marriage ever ended, Veronica Stanfield would leave with very little claim to Harrington wealth. The document guaranteed it. And because Veronica herself had supported the agreement, Margaret assumed it would never become a point of dispute. What Margaret never suspected, what no one in that room truly considered, was that Veronica Stanfield had not approached the prenup as a shield. She had approached it as a map of how power moved through the marriage. And she had saved every step of the process, because structures built on confidence sometimes overlooked one small weakness. They assumed everyone else had stopped paying attention. Veronica never did. The wedding took place on a clear spring afternoon in Connecticut, on the grounds of a historic estate that the Harrington family often used for large gatherings. Everything about the event was elegant, without appearing extravagant. White tents stretched across the lawn. Long tables were decorated with simple arrangements of pale roses and glass candles. A string quartet played softly while guests moved between conversations about business travel and the quiet alliances that often formed in rooms like these. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect beginning. Philip Harrington appeared genuinely happy. Veronica Stanfield stood beside him with the same composed calm she carried into every situation. Her wedding dress was simple compared to many Margaret had suggested during the planning process. Veronica had insisted on something understated. Margaret Harrington did not object. She had learned long ago that some battles were unnecessary when the outcome already favored you. The prenup had been signed months earlier. From Margaret's perspective, the important protections were already in place. The ceremony itself was brief. When Philip and Veronica exchanged vows, there was a quiet sincerity in the way Philip looked at her. Whatever structures surrounded the marriage, his feelings were genuine. Veronica knew that. That knowledge made everything more complicated. After the ceremony, the reception unfolded smoothly. Margaret moved through the guests with practiced grace, introducing Veronica to investors, philanthropists, and family friends who had known Philip since childhood. Each introduction followed a similar pattern. "This is my daughter-in-law, Veronica Stanfield." Margaret's tone was warm, polite, but Veronica noticed something subtle beneath it. Margaret never mentioned Veronica's profession, never mentioned the firm she worked for, never mentioned the career she had built before meeting Philip. To most people in the room, Veronica became a different kind of identity. The Harrington bride. It was not an insult, but it was a narrowing. Veronica noticed. She did not correct anyone. The reception continued late into the evening. As guests began to leave, Charles Harrington stood quietly near the terrace, watching the last conversations fade into the night. Veronica stepped beside him. "Thank you for welcoming me into your family," she said. Charles studied her thoughtfully. "You're observant," he said. Veronica tilted her head slightly. "Is that unusual?" Charles gave a faint smile. "In this family." He paused before continuing. "It might be." That was the first and last time Charles ever spoke so directly to her. Within 2 months of the wedding, Veronica moved from Chicago to New York. Philip already owned an apartment in Manhattan, technically a property held within one of Harrington Capital's real estate portfolios. The apartment overlooked the East River and occupied the upper floors of a quiet building where most residents belonged to the same financial circles as Philip's family. The apartment was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist architecture, a view that stretched across the city skyline at night like a field of quiet lights. But Veronica noticed something else. The apartment had been decorated long before she arrived. Margaret had arranged most of it. The furniture had been chosen by a designer Margaret preferred. The artwork reflected the Harrington aesthetic, expensive but conservative. There were very few empty spaces left for anything new. Veronica didn't complain. Instead, she unpacked her own belongings slowly over several weeks. Books, personal notebooks, a small framed photograph of her parents standing in front of their Oregon home. Philip noticed one evening while she was arranging the shelves. "You can change anything you want here," he said casually. Veronica glanced around the apartment. "Your mother seems to like how it looks." Philip shrugged. "She likes controlling things." The comment sounded lighthearted, but it carried truth. Margaret Harrington visited the apartment often during the first months of their marriage. Sometimes she brought flowers. Sometimes she brought suggestions. "You may want to consider replacing the dining chairs," she said one afternoon while walking through the living room. "They're lovely, but a little informal for certain guests." Another time, she suggested rearranging Veronica's bookshelves. These types of rooms usually benefit from symmetry. Veronica listened politely. She rarely argued. But she began to notice patterns. Margaret's suggestions rarely asked what Veronica preferred. They simply assumed the Harrington standard would apply. Philip noticed the tension once or twice, but his response was predictable. "That's just how my mother is," he would say. "She's been managing the family's social life for 30 years. Veronica nodded each time, but she began keeping quiet mental notes, not accusations, just observations. 3 months into the marriage, Veronica returned to work. She had transferred to her firm's New York office before leaving Chicago. Her position remained the same: risk analysis, financial structure, review, compliance, oversight. The work gave her a kind of balance. Inside the office, Veronica existed independently from the Harrington name. Her colleagues knew her as a disciplined analyst who noticed things others overlooked. They did not treat her like someone who had married into wealth. Veronica valued that separation. Margaret, however, seemed less enthusiastic. During one Sunday dinner at the Harrington townhouse, she raised the subject casually. "I was speaking with one of Philip's colleagues last week," Margaret said while sipping her wine. He mentioned that many families prefer their daughters-in-law to focus on philanthropic work instead of corporate jobs. Veronica looked up calmly. "I enjoy my work." Margaret smiled. "Of course, but eventually you may find your time better spent representing the family in other ways." Philip shifted slightly in his chair. "Mom, Veronica likes what she does." Margaret nodded. "I'm simply suggesting options." Charles remained silent. Veronica answered politely. "I'll keep that in mind." The conversation moved on, but that evening, Veronica opened a new notebook on her desk at home. She wrote down the date. Then she summarized the conversation. She did not do this out of resentment. She did it because Veronica Stanfield had always believed something simple. Patterns mattered, and the only way to see patterns clearly was to record events as they happened. Margaret Harrington continued visiting frequently during the first year. Some visits were pleasant. Others carried the same quiet pressure Veronica had noticed from the beginning. Margaret asked about guest lists for future events. She suggested which charities Veronica might support. She occasionally commented on Veronica's clothing before social gatherings. None of the remarks were openly hostile, but they all pointed in the same direction. Margaret Harrington had spent decades shaping the identity of the Harrington family, and she had no intention of allowing someone else to influence it. Veronica understood this earlier than Philip did, but she still believed the marriage itself could remain separate from Margaret's expectations. Philip loved her. Of that she was certain. What Veronica did not fully understand yet was how difficult it would be for Philip to separate himself from the structure that had shaped his entire life, because Harrington families did not simply operate through money. They operated through loyalty. And Margaret Harrington expected loyalty above everything else, even above marriage. Veronica Stanfield noticed that long before anyone else admitted it. And quietly, she wrote it down. The first year of Veronica Stanfield's marriage did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It changed slowly. So slowly, in fact, that anyone observing from the outside would have described the Harrington household as perfectly stable. There were dinners, charity events, business gatherings where Philip stood confidently beside his father while Margaret moved through the room, greeting investors and board members. Veronica attended many of those events. She learned the rhythm quickly: when to speak, when to listen, when to step slightly behind Philip, so the attention remained on the Harrington name. To most guests, she appeared calm and gracious. Margaret Harrington often praised her publicly. "Veronica is adjusting beautifully," she would say to friends during quiet conversations over champagne. "New York can be overwhelming for people who didn't grow up here." The sentence sounded supportive, but Veronica understood the implication hidden inside it. You are still an outsider. Philip never noticed the nuance. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to dwell on it. In private, their marriage remained mostly peaceful. Philip was affectionate in ways that were genuine rather than performative. He listened when Veronica spoke about work. He asked questions about the financial cases she reviewed. Sometimes, late at night in their apartment overlooking the East River, they would sit together on the balcony discussing the strange psychology of wealth. "Money changes how people behave," Philip said once. Veronica nodded. "It amplifies what was already there." Philip leaned back in his chair. "You think that's true about my family?" Veronica did not answer immediately. She chose her words carefully. "I think your family has spent a long time protecting what they built." Philip smiled faintly. "That sounds like something my mother would say." Veronica did not mention that Margaret's idea of protection often involved control. Instead, she watched the river moving quietly beneath the city lights. But outside those quiet moments, something else was happening. Margaret Harrington had begun shaping the environment around Veronica in ways that were subtle enough to appear harmless. It started with invitations. or rather, the absence of them. Several of Philip's extended family gatherings took place without Veronica receiving the initial invitation. Instead, Philip would mention the event casually. Mom asked if we could stop by Sunday afternoon, he would say. Veronica would nod. But when they arrived, she sometimes discovered the gathering had been planned for weeks. Everyone else already knew the details. It was not overt exclusion, just a quiet way of ensuring Veronica was always one step behind the social rhythm of the Harrington family. Then there were conversations. Margaret had a particular talent for framing criticism as concern. During one luncheon with several of Margaret's longtime friends, the subject of Veronica's work came up again. "She still works in finance," one woman asked. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, she enjoys it. Though I sometimes worry it might be exhausting balancing that with the responsibilities of this family." The women around the table exchanged sympathetic looks. "Oh, of course," one said. "These families come with certain expectations." Veronica heard the conversation clearly. She simply continued eating her salad. Later that evening, she opened her notebook again. She wrote down the date. Then she summarized the conversation. Not emotionally, factually. Location, participants. Exact wording she remembered. Alas, Veronica did not yet know whether those records would ever matter. But she had learned long ago that patterns only became visible when details were preserved. Margaret's influence extended beyond social situations. Gradually, she began involving Philip more directly in financial decisions connected to Harrington Capital. Philip had always worked within the company, but now Margaret encouraged him to take on more responsibilities connected to family investments. "These opportunities don't appear forever," she told him one evening during dinner at the townhouse. "You need to start preparing for the next stage." Philip appreciated the trust, but the increased workload changed his schedule. More meetings, more late nights, more phone calls with Margaret about financial strategies. Veronica noticed something interesting during those conversations. Philip often repeated Margaret's suggestions later, almost word for word. It was not intentional. It was simply habit. Philip had grown up inside a structure where Margaret's judgment carried enormous weight. Loyalty to family decisions had always been expected. Veronica understood this intellectually. But she also saw the consequences. The more Philip relied on Margaret's guidance, the less independent his financial choices became. At first, this remained a background detail. Then one evening, Veronica noticed something unusual while reviewing their monthly household finances. Philip had suggested earlier that they combine certain accounts for convenience. The arrangement seemed practical. But while reviewing the statements, Veronica saw a transfer she did not recognize. A large one, nearly $80,000. The destination account belonged to a holding company connected to Harrington Capital. When Philip came home later that night, Veronica asked about it calmly. "What was the transfer to Harrington Holdings last week?" Philip looked mildly surprised. "Oh, yes." He loosened his tie while walking toward the kitchen. "It's temporary. My mother asked if we could move some funds to cover a short-term investment position." Veronica watched him quietly. "From our account?" "It's not exactly our account," Philip said lightly. "It's part of the family's financial network." Veronica nodded slowly. "How long will the funds be there?" Philip poured himself a glass of water. "Probably a few weeks." "Was there documentation?" Philip hesitated slightly. "It's informal. Just a family transfer." Veronica did not argue. Instead, she said something simple. "Next time, I'd appreciate knowing before it happens." Philip looked apologetic. "Of course, I didn't think it would matter." Veronica believed him. But later that night, after Philip had gone to bed, she opened her laptop. She downloaded the bank statement. Then she began creating a small spreadsheet. Date, amount, destination account, reason given. She saved the file in a folder labeled simply Household Records. Over the next several months, a few more transfers appeared. Different amounts, different dates. Each time Philip explained them in the same casual tone, "Just helping my mother balance something temporarily." Veronica never confronted him, but she recorded every detail. At work, her colleague Olivia Chen noticed something different about her one afternoon. "You've been very quiet lately," Olivia said during lunch. Veronica looked up from her coffee. "I'm always quiet." Olivia smiled. "True. But now you look like you're solving something." Veronica considered the comment. "I'm observing something." What kind of something? Veronica thought for a moment. Family structures? Olivia laughed softly. "That sounds complicated." "It is." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "Are you okay?" Veronica nodded. "Yes." And she meant it. Nothing terrible had happened. No arguments, no betrayals. Just a series of small events, slowly forming a pattern. A pattern Margaret Harrington believed no one else could see. But Veronica Stanfield had spent most of her life studying patterns, and the ones appearing inside her marriage were becoming impossible to ignore. The first transfer Philip had described as temporary returned to their account 3 weeks later. $80,000 moved back with a brief memo attached to the transaction record. Internal adjustment. Philip mentioned it casually while they were having breakfast one morning. "See, I told you it would come back." Veronica nodded while stirring her coffee. "Yes." Her tone carried no accusation, but the spreadsheet she had created inside her laptop recorded something new. The return date, the memo, the account number that had sent the funds back. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Families with complex investment networks often moved money between holding accounts for short periods. Liquidity management, temporary coverage for positions, bridge funding between deals. Veronica understood those mechanisms better than most people. But what interested her was not the existence of the transfers. It was the pattern forming around them. Over the next 4 months, 3 additional transfers occurred. Not identical, but similar. One for $50,000, another for $120,000. Then a smaller amount, $35,000, moved out and returned 2 weeks later. Each time Philip offered the same explanation. Mom needed temporary coverage for something inside the firm, and each time the money eventually returned. Veronica never argued. But she noticed something else. None of the transfers had written documentation beyond the basic bank memo. No formal loan agreements, no recorded interest, no written timeline for repayment. Inside large financial organizations, those kinds of movements were rarely handled so casually, especially not when the amounts reached 6 figures. One evening, Veronica sat in the living room after Philip had gone to bed reviewing the spreadsheet she had been quietly updating. She added a second column, email references. Then she began searching her inbox. Margaret occasionally sent Philip messages discussing financial matters. Sometimes Philip forwarded those emails to Veronica simply so she would understand why his schedule had changed. Most of the messages were vague, but 2 of them mentioned liquidity issues within one of Harrington Capital's subsidiary funds. Veronica copied the dates into the spreadsheet. They matched 2 of the transfer dates almost exactly. She leaned back in her chair. Interesting. The situation did not necessarily indicate wrongdoing. Large investment firms often used internal resources to stabilize temporary gaps in liquidity. But Veronica noticed something important. Philip had described the transfers as favors to his mother. The email suggested something slightly different. They implied the money was helping stabilize a position within the firm itself, which meant the transaction might not have been purely personal. Veronica closed her laptop and turned off the lights in the living room. For now, the information remained simply that. Information. But patterns rarely revealed their full meaning immediately. Sometimes they required patience. The next development arrived during a dinner at the Harrington townhouse in early autumn. Margaret had invited several investors and longtime family associates for a small gathering. These dinners were less formal than public events, but still carried an atmosphere of quiet importance. Philip sat near the center of the table discussing a new real estate acquisition the firm had been considering. Veronica listened quietly. Across from her, Margaret watched the conversation unfold with approval. "You handled the board discussion well last week," Margaret said to Philip. Philip nodded. "Wasn't too difficult." The liquidity concerns worried some of the older partners, Margaret continued. But the bridge arrangement solved that problem. Veronica's fork paused briefly above her plate. Bridge arrangement. Philip glanced quickly toward Veronica before answering. Yes, it worked out. Margaret continued speaking, apparently unaware of the small exchange. Sometimes the family's internal flexibility allows us to avoid unnecessary outside exposure. Several of the guests nodded in agreement. One of them asked a question about short-term capital strategies. The conversation shifted naturally into technical territory. Veronica resumed eating. But inside her mind, the spreadsheet she had created rearranged itself. Bridge arrangement, liquidity concerns, internal flexibility. Those phrases aligned closely with the transfers she'd been recording, which meant the money moving through their personal account might not have been a simple favor to Margaret. It might have been used to stabilize an investment position within Harrington Capital. If that was true, then the funds had effectively served as temporary operational capital. Veronica did not react. She finished dinner calmly. Later that evening, while Philip spoke privately with his father in the study, Margaret joined Veronica on the terrace. The autumn air had grown cooler. "You've been very quiet tonight," Margaret observed. Veronica rested her hands lightly on the railing overlooking the garden. "I was listening." Margaret studied her carefully. That's a useful habit in families like ours. Veronica turned slightly. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Information moves constantly in financial circles. People who speak too quickly often miss important signals." Veronica nodded. "That's true." Margaret's expression softened just slightly. "You've adjusted well, Veronica. Some women would find our environment intimidating. I don't find it intimidating." "No." Veronica shook her head gently. "Just structured." Margaret considered the answer. Then she gave a small, approving nod. "That's an accurate description." Inside the house, voices from the dining room drifted faintly through the open doors. Margaret placed her glass on the terrace table. "There's something you should understand," she said calmly. "Families like ours rely on trust." Veronica waited. "When financial matters arise, we handle them internally whenever possible. It keeps the structure stable." Veronica understood the statement clearly. Margaret was explaining the logic behind the transfers. Without realizing, she was confirming Veronica's suspicions. "I see," Veronica said. Margaret's tone remained pleasant. "Philip sometimes helps facilitate those arrangements." Veronica nodded again. "That makes sense." Margaret seemed satisfied. She believed the explanation had reassured her daughter-in-law. What Margaret did not know was that Veronica had already recorded every transaction connected to those arrangements. Later that night, Veronica updated the spreadsheet again. She added a new column, dinner conversation references. Then she typed a short note beside the most recent transfer, possible bridge funding. Still, she made no accusations. There were too many missing pieces. Patterns required confirmation. And Veronica Stanfield never drew conclusions before the data was complete. But she understood something important now. The money moving through their account was not random. It served a purpose within the Harrington financial structure. A structure Margaret believed no outsider could fully understand. Veronica closed her laptop and looked out across the dark city skyline. Margaret Harrington had built her authority on the assumption that she controlled every financial movement within the family. That assumption had protected her for decades. But structures built on certainty sometimes overlooked something simple. They assumed no one else was studying the system carefully. Veronica Stanfield was. And she had begun mapping it piece by piece. The dinner that revealed Margaret Harrington's true intentions took place in early winter. Snow had fallen across Manhattan during the afternoon, softening the sharp edges of the city into something quieter. By the time evening arrived, the streets outside the Harrington townhouse were dusted in white and glowing under the reflection of streetlights. Inside the house, however, everything remained carefully controlled. Margaret had arranged the dinner weeks earlier. Officially, it was a small gathering to celebrate the closing of a new Harrington Capital real estate acquisition in Boston. Unofficially, it served a different purpose, one Veronica had begun to recognize during the past year. Margaret liked environments where hierarchy was visible. Long tables, assigned seating, guests who understood their place in the social architecture of the evening. That night, the dining room table held 12 people. Charles Harrington sat at one end, Margaret at the other. Philip sat midway down the right side. Veronica sat beside him. Several of Harrington Capital's longtime partners filled the remaining seats, along with two couples who had invested alongside the family for decades. The conversation during the first course revolved around the Boston acquisition. Philip described the property with the calm confidence he had developed during the past year. "The structure will allow us to reposition the portfolio within 18 months, he explained. One of the investors nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would have liked that deal." Margaret smiled faintly at the comment. Philip had begun earning credibility inside the firm. But Veronica noticed something else. Whenever Philip described a strategic decision, he occasionally glanced toward his mother before finishing the explanation. The habit was subtle, almost unconscious. Margaret never corrected him. But her quiet presence shaped the room. Dinner progressed through several courses. Wine loosened conversation. Stories about past investments circulated around the table. Eventually, the topic shifted away from business. One of the investors' wives, Eleanor Whitmore, turned toward Veronica. "And how are you enjoying New York, Veronica?" she asked warmly. Veronica smiled politely. "I've grown to appreciate it." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Margaret told us you're still working in finance." Margaret's voice entered the conversation smoothly. "Yes, Veronica works in risk analysis, though she's beginning to understand that family responsibilities can sometimes become more important." The tone sounded pleasant, but Veronica heard the underlying message clearly. Philip glanced at his mother. "Veronica enjoys her work," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "Of course she does." Eleanor laughed lightly. "Well, at least she understands numbers. That's more than most spouses in this room can say." The table chuckled. Margaret took a sip of wine. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "Understanding numbers is useful, especially when entering a family like ours." Veronica felt several pairs of eyes turn toward her. She remained calm. Margaret continued speaking. "Our family has spent decades protecting what we've built. That requires certain safeguards." Charles shifted slightly at the end of the table but said nothing. Philip's expression tightened. Mom Margaret raised a hand, gently stopping him. "I'm simply explaining how these things work." Then she turned directly toward Veronica. "You were very reasonable about the prenup agreement before the wedding." The word prenup drifted through the room like a small stone dropped into still water. Everyone at the table understood its meaning. Veronica folded her hands calmly in her lap. "Yes," she said. Margaret smiled politely. It showed maturity. No one spoke for a moment. Margaret set down her glass. "In families like ours," she continued, clarity about financial boundaries prevents unnecessary misunderstandings later. Eleanor Whitmore nodded. "That's wise." Margaret's eyes remained on Veronica. "Yes, and fortunately Philip and Veronica handled that matter quite responsibly." Philip shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, this really isn't necessary," Margaret interrupted again, still smiling. "It's perfectly appropriate, Philip. These conversations are part of adult life." Then she looked directly at Veronica. "You understood from the beginning that Harrington family assets remained separate." Veronica held Margaret's gaze. "I understood the terms of the agreement." Margaret nodded. "And those terms ensure that no matter what happens in the future, the family's financial foundation remains intact." The sentence hung quietly in the air. Several guests looked down at their plates. Others pretended to focus on their wine. Margaret leaned slightly back in her chair. It's comforting to know these things are settled in advance. Philip's voice was quiet but strained. That's enough, Mom. Margaret looked mildly surprised. I'm only discussing the agreement both of you signed. Philip said nothing further. Veronica watched the exchange silently. She noticed something interesting. Margaret believed she was reinforcing stability, but the words she had chosen carried a sharper implication. They suggested that if the marriage ever failed, Veronica's position inside the Harrington structure would disappear completely. Margaret had not said the words directly, but the meaning was clear enough for everyone at the table. You entered this family under our conditions, and you leave under them too. The conversation slowly shifted back to safer topics after that. Charles asked one of the investors about a property development in Florida. Wine glasses were refilled. Laughter returned in small bursts, but the atmosphere had changed. When dinner ended, guests moved toward the sitting room for coffee and brandy. Philip disappeared briefly into his father's study. Veronica stepped outside onto the back terrace. The cold air carried the faint smell of snow. A moment later, Margaret joined her. I hope you didn't mind the conversation at dinner, Margaret said lightly. Veronica looked across the dark garden. I didn't. Margaret studied her carefully. Some people are uncomfortable discussing financial boundaries. I'm not. Margaret nodded. That's why I've respected you. She paused before continuing. But it's important that expectations remain clear. Veronica turned slightly toward her. They are. Margaret seemed satisfied. Good. Inside the house, voices drifted through the open door. Margaret looked toward the dining room. You should understand something about families like ours, she said calmly. Structures survive only when everyone respects them. Veronica held her gaze. I understand structures. Margaret smiled faintly. Yes. She placed a hand lightly on the terrace railing. And the prenup ensures that structure remains intact. Veronica nodded once. Then she said nothing else. Later that night, back in their apartment, Philip sat quietly at the kitchen counter while Veronica removed her coat. I'm sorry about dinner, he said. Veronica hung the coat carefully. It's all right. Philip rubbed his forehead. She shouldn't have brought up the prenup like that. Veronica poured herself a glass of water. She believed she was explaining something important. Philip looked up. He didn't seem upset. Veronica took a sip of water. I wasn't. Philip studied her expression. You're surprisingly calm about all of this. Veronica met his gaze. Clarity is useful. Philip shook his head. You and my mother both say that word a lot. Veronica smiled slightly. Yes. What Philip did not realize was that Margaret's words during dinner had confirmed something Veronica had already begun to suspect. Margaret believed the prenup gave her complete control over the outcome of any future conflict. That belief made her confident. Perhaps too confident. Later that night, Veronica opened her notebook again. She wrote down the date. Then she recorded Margaret's statements from dinner as precisely as she could remember them. Not out of anger, just documentation. Because Veronica Stanfield had learned something important about power long before she ever entered the Harrington family. People who believe they are protected by structures often reveal their intentions freely. They assume those structures cannot be challenged. Margaret Harrington believed the prenup guaranteed Veronica would leave with nothing. Veronica Stanfield knew something Margaret did not. The agreement Margaret trusted so completely had been written with one assumption, that everyone involved would act honestly. And honesty was something Veronica had already begun to question. Margaret Harrington believed the conversation at the winter dinner had accomplished something important. In her mind, the matter had been settled clearly in front of witnesses. The Harrington family structure was secure. The prenup ensured it. And Veronica Stanfield, calm, polite, and silent throughout the evening, had accepted that reality. Margaret interpreted Veronica's quiet composure as resignation. She was wrong. 2 weeks after that dinner, Veronica scheduled a meeting with Daniel Reeves. Daniel's office was located in a quiet building near Bryant Park. The firm specialized in financial litigation and complex marital agreements, particularly cases involving high-net-worth families. Daniel Reeves himself had the appearance of someone who had spent decades watching powerful people argue over money. He spoke slowly. He listened more than he interrupted. When Veronica arrived, she carried a thin leather folder and a laptop. Daniel gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Miss Stanfield, please." Veronica sat down calmly. "You mentioned on the phone that you wanted a second review of a prenuptial agreement," Daniel said. "Yes." Daniel folded his hands. "That's fairly common, but usually people do it before the wedding." Veronica nodded slightly. "I did review it before the wedding." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And now I want to understand it more thoroughly." Daniel gave a faint smile. "That's an unusual request, but I'm not opposed to unusual." Veronica placed the folder on the desk. Inside were several documents: the signed prenup, earlier drafts, printed copies of email exchanges. Daniel opened the first document and began reading. The room remained quiet for several minutes. When he finished the first section, he looked up. "This is a very standard high-asset prenup," he said. Veronica waited. Daniel continued flipping through the pages. "Harrington Capital, real estate holdings, trust protections," he murmured. After 10 minutes, he leaned back slightly. "From a structural standpoint, the agreement heavily protects your husband's family assets. Yes." Daniel studied Veronica carefully. "Did you expect something different? No. Then what exactly concerns you?" Veronica opened her laptop. On the screen appeared the spreadsheet she had been quietly maintaining for months. Daniel leaned forward. "What am I looking at? Financial transfers," Veronica said, "between accounts connected to Harrington Capital." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "And these transfers move through a personal account shared by Philip and me." Daniel scrolled slowly through the spreadsheet. Dates, amounts, destination accounts. Then a second column referencing emails. He frowned slightly. "Some of these amounts are significant." "Yes." "Were they documented as loans nor investment contributions?" No. Daniel sat back in his chair. "Did your husband explain them?" "He said they were temporary internal adjustments for family matters." Daniel tapped the desk thoughtfully. "Which could be true." "Yes, but you think something else may be happening." Veronica nodded. "Possibly." Daniel returned his attention to the prenup. "Let's start with the agreement itself," he said. He turned to a section roughly halfway through the document. "Here," he said, pointing. Veronica leaned slightly forward. Daniel read aloud. "Both parties affirm that all financial disclosures made prior to this agreement are complete and accurate to the best of their knowledge." He looked up. "This clause appears in most prenups." "Yes, but it matters." Why? Daniel turned the page. "Because many of the protections inside this agreement depend on that disclosure being truthful." Veronica remained silent. Daniel continued. "For example, if a spouse intentionally conceals assets, misrepresents financial activity, or mixes protected assets in ways that contradict the agreement." He tapped the document lightly. "Then some protections become vulnerable." Veronica's expression did not change. Daniel leaned back. "I'm not saying that has happened here. I understand. But if financial activity contradicts the representations made in the prenup, it can complicate things." Veronica opened another file on her laptop. A collection of emails appeared on the screen. Daniel leaned closer. "These are communications between you and the Harrington family lawyer?" "Yes." Daniel began reading through them. His eyebrows lifted slightly after a few minutes. "These emails show you requested several clarifications during the drafting process?" "Yes." "And you specifically asked for stronger language regarding financial transparency?" "Yes." Daniel looked impressed. "That was careful." Veronica closed the laptop halfway. "I prefer clarity." Daniel nodded slowly. You mentioned on the phone that your mother-in-law believes the prenup protects the family entirely. That seems to be her assumption. Daniel exhaled quietly. That assumption is very common. He tapped the document again. Prenups are powerful agreements, but they are not absolute shields. Veronica said nothing. Daniel studied her for a moment. You've already been documenting financial activity for months. Yes. Why? Veronica considered the question. Because patterns matter. Daniel smiled faintly. You sound like an investigator. I'm an analyst. Daniel closed the prenup and folded his hands. Let me be very clear about something. Veronica waited. If the financial activity you've recorded turns out to involve undisclosed liabilities, hidden obligations, or misuse of marital funds, he paused. Then the legal consequences could become complicated for the Harrington side. Veronica nodded once. That's why I wanted to understand the structure. Daniel looked thoughtful. Most people only begin collecting information after a conflict begins. Veronica's voice remained calm. I prefer preparation. Daniel leaned back again. Well, he said quietly, if a conflict ever does begin, you will be unusually well prepared. The meeting ended an hour later. Veronica stepped back onto the Manhattan sidewalk as evening traffic moved slowly through the streets. Snow from the previous week had melted. The city had returned to its usual rhythm. Inside the Harrington townhouse across town, Margaret Harrington was hosting another planning meeting for an upcoming charity gala. Philip was there as well. Margaret spoke confidently about guest lists and sponsorships. To Margaret, the structure of her world remained stable. The family wealth, the legal protections, the prenup, everything exactly where it belonged. What Margaret did not know was that Veronica Stanfield had just finished mapping the legal structure she trusted so completely. And Daniel Reeves had confirmed something quietly important. The prenup Margaret believed guaranteed control, only worked as intended if every financial representation connected to it remained honest. Veronica Stanfield had begun to suspect that honesty might not exist everywhere inside the Harrington structure, and now she knew exactly where to keep looking. Winter passed slowly in New York. For most people inside the Harrington social circle, the season unfolded through a familiar series of dinners, investment meetings, charity events, and quiet negotiations that took place behind the polished doors of boardrooms and private offices. For Veronica Stanfield, however, winter became a period of observation. She did not change her behavior. She still attended events with Philip. She still visited the Harrington townhouse for Sunday dinners. She still greeted Margaret with the same calm politeness she had always shown. But privately, Veronica's attention had sharpened. Daniel Reeves had given her something more valuable than reassurance. He had given her a framework, a way to interpret the financial movements she had already been tracking. The next step, Daniel had explained during their final minutes together, was not confrontation. It was confirmation. Never build a case on suspicion alone, he had said. Patterns matter, but patterns need context. Veronica understood that instinctively. Context came from conversations, emails, decisions people made when they believed no one was studying them closely. That opportunity appeared sooner than she expected. One evening in late February, Philip returned home later than usual. His expression carried the fatigue of someone who had spent too many hours inside financial discussions. Veronica looked up from the kitchen counter where she had been reviewing a work report. Long meeting, she asked. Philip loosened his tie. Board strategy session. With your mother? Philip nodded. And Gregory. Gregory Holt again. Veronica remembered the name immediately. The Harrington family lawyer. Philip poured himself a glass of water. They're worried about one of the real estate funds. Veronica waited. Philip rarely shared details about internal Harrington matters, but tonight he seemed unusually open. Some investors got nervous about a temporary liquidity issue, he continued. How temporary? Veronica asked calmly. Philip shrugged. Not serious. just timing issues between asset sales. Veronica nodded slightly. That explanation aligned closely with the pattern she had been observing. Did the fund need additional capital? She asked. Philip hesitated. Briefly. How was that handled? Philip took a sip of water. Mom arranged bridge coverage internally. Veronica said nothing. Philip looked at her. You're doing that analyst thing again. What thing? The quiet stare where you're analyzing everything. Veronica smiled faintly. Habit. Philip laughed. Well, you don't need to worry about this one. Why not? Because the situation is already stabilized. How Philip hesitated again. Then he answered casually. Short-term capital adjustments. Veronica recognized the phrase immediately. Margaret had used almost identical wording during the dinner conversation months earlier. Bridge arrangement, internal flexibility, short-term capital adjustments, different phrases, same meaning. Money moved quickly inside the Harrington system when something needed stabilizing. Was the coverage provided through Harrington Capital directly? Veronica asked. Philip shook his head. No. That would have triggered external disclosures. Veronica leaned slightly against the counter. Then how? Philip paused for just a moment. Through family resources. There it was, a simple answer, but one that carried more weight than Philip realized. Because Veronica knew exactly what family resources might mean. Their account, or other private accounts connected to the Harrington network. Philip placed the empty glass in the sink. Anyway, it's handled now. Veronica nodded. Good. The conversation ended there, but later that evening, Veronica sat at her desk in the living room and updated her spreadsheet again. She added a note beside the most recent transfer. Possible liquidity support for Harrington Fund. Then she opened her email archive. Using the dates of the transfers she had recorded, she searched for messages around those same time periods. Most of the emails were routine, but one caught her attention. It was a message Philip had forwarded months earlier without thinking much about it. The sender was Margaret Harrington. The subject line read simply, short-term coverage. Veronica opened it. The email itself was brief. Philip, we'll need temporary coverage for the fund gap until the property sale closes. Gregory believes we can handle it internally to avoid unnecessary visibility. Let's discuss tonight, Mom. Veronica stared at the screen quietly. The email did not explicitly mention any specific accounts, but combined with the transfer records she had been collecting, it confirmed something important. Margaret was coordinating these financial adjustments directly with Philip. And Gregory Holt was aware of the arrangement. Veronica copied the email into a new folder labeled Supporting Correspondence. Then she leaned back in her chair. Still not proof of wrongdoing, but increasingly clear evidence of how the Harrington financial structure actually operated. 2 weeks later, another opportunity appeared. Philip and Veronica attended a small cocktail gathering hosted by one of Harrington Capital's senior partners. The event took place in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Most of the guests were investors or financial professionals. The conversations moved easily between markets, real estate, and the uncertain economic outlook for the coming year. At one point during the evening, Veronica stepped onto the balcony for fresh air. A moment later, she heard familiar voices approaching behind her. Margaret and Gregory Holt. They had not noticed her standing near the far side of the balcony, where the shadows from the glass railing obscured the corner. Their conversation continued quietly. We can't keep doing that indefinitely, Gregory was saying. Margaret's voice remained composed. We won't need to. The fund gap was larger than expected. Yes, but the property sale will close soon. Gregory lowered his voice further. Even so, we should avoid moving additional personal funds through Philip's account. Veronica remained perfectly still. Margaret answered calmly. That arrangement was temporary. Gregory sighed softly. Temporary arrangements have a habit of appearing less temporary during litigation. Margaret's tone sharpened slightly. There will be no litigation. Margaret, I'm simply advising caution. Silence followed for a moment. Then Margaret spoke again. The structure remains protected. The prenup ensures that. Gregory did not respond immediately. Finally, he said quietly, as long as financial disclosures remain accurate. Margaret gave a faint laugh. They are. Gregory did not sound entirely convinced. Veronica heard the faint sound of glasses clinking as the two of them moved back inside. She remained on the balcony for another minute before returning to the party. Her expression remained calm. No one suspected she had heard anything unusual. But that night, when she returned home, Veronica added another entry to her records. This time, she created a new document, conversation notes. She wrote down every detail she could remember, the location, the participants, the exact phrases Gregory and Margaret had used. Temporary arrangements, personal funds through Philip's account, financial disclosures. When she finished writing, Veronica closed the notebook slowly. For the first time since she began documenting the Harrington financial structure, something had shifted. Until now, the evidence had been indirect. Transfers, emails, patterns. Now there was something else. Confirmation. Margaret Harrington believed the prenup protected her completely. But Gregory Holt, the lawyer who had written that agreement, sounded less certain. And Veronica Stanfield now understood why. Because the financial movements Margaret had been coordinating were quietly bending the very rules that prenup depended on. Rules about transparency, rules about disclosure, rules about how assets were supposed to remain separate. Margaret believed she controlled the structure. But Veronica had begun to see the weak points inside it. And once a structure revealed its weak points, someone patient enough could follow them all the way to the truth. By the time spring arrived in New York, the Harrington marriage had begun to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Nothing dramatic had happened. There had been no explosive arguments, no accusations, no moment when either Veronica Stanfield or Philip Harrington announced that something inside the marriage had broken. Instead, the distance grew slowly. Philip spent more time at Harrington Capital. The firm had entered a period of intense activity following several large property acquisitions. Board meetings stretched late into the evening. Investors demanded updates. Market fluctuations created constant pressure. Margaret Harrington was deeply involved in every strategic discussion. Philip, eager to prove his leadership within the firm, rarely refused her requests for additional meetings. Some nights, he returned home after midnight. Other nights, he stayed at the townhouse working late with his father and the firm's legal advisors. Veronica never complained. She continued her own work in risk analysis, with the same quiet focus she had always maintained. But the structure of their marriage was changing. Conversations became shorter. Shared dinners became less frequent. When they did speak, the subjects remained practical schedules, events, travel plans. One evening, Philip returned home later than usual, his expression strained. Veronica noticed immediately. "You look tired," she said from the kitchen. Philip dropped his briefcase beside the counter. "It's been a long day." She poured him a glass of water. "More problems with the fund?" Philip looked at her with mild surprise. "How did you know that?" Veronica shrugged slightly. "You've mentioned it several times." Philip nodded slowly. "Yeah, the liquidity issue isn't as simple as we thought." Veronica remained quiet. Philip continued speaking almost as if thinking out loud. "The property sale that was supposed to close last month got delayed. Now the fund needs additional coverage until the new closing date." "How much coverage?" Veronica asked. Philip rubbed the back of his neck. "A few million." Veronica's expression did not change. "And the firm doesn't want to bring in outside capital?" Philip nodded. "That would create too much visibility." Veronica had expected that answer. Visibility meant disclosure. Disclosure meant questions. Questions were something Margaret Harrington avoided whenever possible. "How is the firm covering the gap?" Veronica asked calmly. Philip hesitated. "Internally." The same word again. "Internally." Veronica studied his face carefully. Through family resources, Philip looked slightly uncomfortable. "Something like that." Veronica nodded slowly. She did not press further. But later that night, after Philip had gone to bed, she opened her laptop and reviewed the spreadsheet again. The pattern she had been tracking was expanding. The most recent transfer from their account 2 weeks earlier had been significantly larger than previous ones. $200,000. Still labeled simply as an internal adjustment. Still returned later. But now, Philip himself had confirmed something new. The total liquidity problem inside the Harrington fund was far larger than the amounts moving through their account alone, which meant other personal accounts might also be involved, or the transactions were layered through multiple internal channels. Either way, the structure Margaret believed she controlled was becoming increasingly complex. And complexity often created vulnerability. 2 days later, Veronica received an email from Daniel Reeves. Subject: quick question. She opened it. Daniel's message was brief. Have you noticed any changes in the financial activity we discussed? Veronica replied within minutes. Yes, increased transfers, larger amounts, still described as temporary internal coverage. Daniel responded almost immediately. That aligns with a liquidity gap scenario. Continue documenting. Do not confront. Veronica closed the email. She had never intended to confront anyone. Confrontation destroyed clarity. Observation preserved it. Meanwhile, Margaret Harrington had begun making her own adjustments. She sensed the tension developing between Philip and Veronica, though she interpreted it differently. Margaret believed the marriage was weakening. In her view, the explanation was simple. Philip had responsibilities that Veronica did not fully understand. Families like the Harringtons required loyalty above personal preference. If Veronica struggled with that reality, the marriage would naturally become strained. Margaret did not see this as tragedy. She saw it as correction. One Sunday afternoon, she invited Philip to the townhouse for a private conversation. Charles Harrington remained in his study, while Margaret and Philip sat in the library overlooking the garden. "You've been working too hard," Margaret said calmly. Philip smiled faintly. "That's the job." Margaret studied him carefully. "And Veronica?" Philip hesitated. "What about her?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "You've seemed distant lately." Philip looked toward the window. "We're both busy." Margaret's voice remained gentle. "Marriage requires alignment." Philip said nothing. Margaret continued. "You and Veronica come from very different worlds." Philip frowned slightly. That never mattered before. Margaret folded her hands. "It matters now." Philip finally looked at her. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret's tone stayed calm. "I'm suggesting that sometimes people realize they want different lives." Philip exhaled quietly. "We're not getting divorced, Mom." Margaret did not react immediately. Then she said something carefully measured. "If that ever happened, the financial outcome is already clear." Philip's expression tightened. "That's not something I'm thinking about." Margaret smiled faintly. "But it's something the prenup protects." Philip stood up slowly. "Mom." Margaret's voice softened again. "I'm only reminding you that the family structure remains secure no matter what." Philip did not answer. He left the townhouse shortly afterward. When he returned to the apartment that evening, Veronica noticed the tension immediately. "Everything okay?" she asked. Philip removed his coat slowly. "My mother thinks we're heading toward divorce." Veronica did not react. Why would she think that Philip sighed? "Because we've been distant." Veronica poured 2 glasses of water. "Have we?" Philip looked at her. "You tell me." Veronica considered the question carefully. "Our lives have become complicated." Philip nodded. "Work complicates everything." Veronica handed him a glass. "Yes." Philip studied her face. "You're very calm about all this." Veronica smiled slightly. "Calm helps." Philip shook his head. "I never know what you're thinking." Veronica did not answer that, because what she was thinking would have been difficult to explain. Margaret Harrington believed the marriage might end. and she believed the prenup guaranteed Veronica would leave with nothing. That belief had made Margaret comfortable speaking openly about divorce. Comfortable enough to mention it to Philip directly. But Margaret had made one quiet mistake. She had assumed Veronica did not understand the structure of the Harrington financial system. By now, Veronica understood far more than Margaret realized. The liquidity gaps, the bridge funding, the movement of personal funds through accounts that were supposed to remain separate. Each detail added another line to the map Veronica had been building for months. And maps had a way of revealing something important, where power actually moved, and where it could eventually break. Veronica closed her laptop later that night and looked out across the Manhattan skyline. The Harrington structure still appeared strong. Margaret believed she controlled every outcome. But Veronica Stanfield knew something Margaret had overlooked. Structures built on confidence often failed in the same way. They assumed no one else was studying the foundation carefully. Veronica had been studying it from the beginning, and the cracks were starting to appear. By early summer, the distance between Veronica Stanfield and Philip Harrington had settled into something quieter than conflict. They still shared the apartment overlooking the East River. They still attended certain public events together. But the invisible structure of the marriage had changed. Philip slept later and left earlier. His phone rang constantly with calls from Harrington Capital. Several times each week, he spent the night working from the townhouse with his father and the firm's advisors. Margaret Harrington had successfully pulled him deeper into the family's financial orbit. Veronica did not resist. Resistance would have forced explanations. Explanations would have ended the careful observation she had spent nearly 2 years building. Instead, she continued documenting every transfer, every email, every conversation that revealed how the Harrington system actually worked. By June, her records filled 2 digital folders and 1 notebook. And the pattern was unmistakable. The liquidity problems inside the Harrington real estate fund had not disappeared. They had simply been managed quietly through temporary capital movements, some of which passed through accounts connected to Philip. Margaret believed these arrangements were invisible. Veronica knew they were not. Still, she did nothing with the information. Not yet. Because timing mattered. The moment arrived sooner than she expected. It began with a call from Gregory Holt. The Harrington family lawyer rarely contacted Veronica directly. Most legal communication flowed through Philip. But one afternoon, while Veronica was working from home, her phone rang. Miss Stanfield, Gregory's voice asked, "Yes, this is Gregory Holt." Veronica recognized the voice immediately. "How can I help you?" Gregory paused briefly. "I'm calling because your husband and Mrs. Harrington have asked that we schedule a meeting." A legal meeting? Yes. Veronica already knew the answer before he spoke again. "It concerns the possibility of formal separation." She remained silent for a moment. Then she said simply, "I understand." Gregory cleared his throat quietly. "The meeting will take place at our office next Thursday afternoon. Thank you for letting me know." After the call ended, Veronica closed her laptop slowly. The word separation did not surprise her. Margaret had been preparing for it for months. What mattered now was the setting. Gregory Holt's office. A legal environment, where words carried weight, where documents mattered. Exactly the kind of place Veronica had been preparing for. She emailed Daniel Reeves that evening. Daniel replied within minutes. "Good. Attend the meeting. Say very little. Let them speak first." Veronica closed the email. She had no intention of speaking much anyway. Thursday arrived with humid summer heat settling over Manhattan. Gregory Holt's law office occupied the upper floors of a quiet building near Central Park. The conference room where the meeting took place was large but understated. Dark wood table, tall windows overlooking the park, shelves of legal volumes lining the walls. When Veronica entered the room, Margaret Harrington was already seated. Philip sat beside her. Gregory Holt stood near the window, reviewing a folder of documents. Margaret looked up as Veronica entered. "Veronica." Her tone remained calm, almost cordial. Veronica took the seat across from them. Philip looked uncomfortable. Gregory closed the folder and sat down. "Thank you all for coming," he said. The formality of the room made every movement deliberate. Gregory folded his hands on the table. "As you know, we're here to discuss the next steps regarding the potential dissolution of this marriage." Philip shifted slightly in his chair. Margaret remained perfectly still. Gregory continued. "Before we discuss logistics, it's important to clarify the legal framework already in place." He placed a copy of the prenup on the table. "This agreement was signed prior to the marriage." Margaret nodded. "Yes." Gregory turned slightly toward Veronica. "You were represented by counsel at the time, yes?" Gregory glanced down at the document. The agreement clearly outlines the separation of Harrington family assets from marital property. Margaret's voice entered the conversation smoothly. That was the entire purpose. Veronica said nothing. Gregory continued speaking. "In the event of divorce, the agreement specifies that Harrington Capital Holdings family trusts and inherited assets remain outside marital division." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, and loud enough to fill the quiet room. "You should understand something clearly, Veronica." Philip closed his eyes briefly, but Margaret continued. "When this divorce is finalized..." She paused. "You will leave with nothing." The words hung in the air. Gregory Holt did not interrupt. Philip stared down at the table. Veronica looked at Margaret. Her expression did not change. Margaret mistook the silence for acceptance. "The agreement you signed made that outcome perfectly clear," Margaret added. Veronica rested her hands lightly on the table. She spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "I'm aware of the agreement." Margaret gave a faint smile. "Good." Gregory cleared his throat. "We will, of course, follow the procedures outlined in the document." Veronica nodded. "That seems reasonable." Margaret's confidence grew slightly. "You've always been practical, Veronica. I appreciate that." Veronica did not respond. Instead, she reached calmly into the leather folders she had brought with her. Inside were several documents, not many, just enough. She placed the folder on the table. Gregory noticed immediately. "What documents are those?" he asked. Veronica looked at him. "Records." Margaret's smile faded slightly. Gregory leaned forward. "May I?" Veronica nodded. Gregory opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of several emails. Gregory began reading. His expression changed almost immediately. Margaret noticed. "What is it?" she asked. Gregory did not answer right away. Instead, he turned to the first page again. Then he looked at Veronica. "These emails?" "Yes." "Show that the original suggestion for the prenup came from you." Veronica nodded once. "Yes." Margaret frowned. "That's irrelevant." Gregory continued reading. Several emails showed Veronica requesting additional clauses about financial disclosure. Another confirmed that she had asked Gregory directly to strengthen language about transparency. Gregory looked back at Margaret slowly. "This may be more relevant than you think." Margaret's voice sharpened slightly. "The agreement still protects the family assets." Gregory did not respond immediately. Instead, he closed the folder carefully. Then he looked at Veronica again. "You kept copies of all these communications?" "Yes." Gregory nodded slowly. Margaret's confidence had not yet disappeared. But for the first time since the meeting began, it had shifted. Because the prenup she trusted so completely had just revealed something she had never expected. Veronica Stanfield had not merely signed the agreement. She had helped shape it. And she had documented every step of that process. The structure Margaret believed she controlled had just become far more complicated. For a moment after Gregory Holt closed the folder, no one in the conference room spoke. The silence was not dramatic. It was analytical. Gregory had spent most of his career reviewing documents in rooms exactly like this. He had seen negotiations, collapse accusations explode, and families fracture over contracts that were far less complex than the Harrington prenup. What he had just read, however, did not immediately change the legal structure of the agreement. But it changed something else. The narrative. Margaret Harrington had entered the meeting with complete certainty about the story she intended to present. Veronica Stanfield had married into the family. Veronica had signed a prenup designed to protect Harrington wealth. Therefore, Veronica would leave the marriage with nothing. It was a simple structure, clean, confident. Gregory now understood that the story was incomplete. He looked at Veronica again. You maintained full documentation of the drafting process. Yes. Gregory nodded once. That's thorough. Margaret spoke sharply. Gregory, the drafting process is irrelevant. The signed agreement is what matters. Gregory turned toward her. Yes, Margaret, the signed agreement matters. He tapped the folder lightly. But the drafting process can become important if questions arise about disclosure. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. There are no disclosure issues. Gregory did not argue. Instead, he opened the folder again and removed one of the printed emails. He slid it across the table toward Philip. You should read this. Philip hesitated before taking the page. His eyes moved slowly across the text. The email was dated 3 months before the wedding, from Veronica Stanfield to Gregory Holt, subject clause clarification. Gregory, before signing, I want to confirm that the agreement requires full and accurate disclosure of all material financial obligations related to family investment structures. If any liabilities or temporary capital obligations exist that could affect marital finances, those should be clearly stated. Please confirm the wording reflects that expectation. Veronica Philip finished reading and looked up slowly. Gregory handed him a second page. Gregory's response. Yes, Miss Stanfield. The agreement assumes both parties are entering with accurate disclosures regarding assets, liabilities, and financial structures. That language has been reinforced in Section 7. Philip exhaled quietly. Margaret spoke again. This is exactly what I've been saying. The agreement was transparent. Gregory's voice remained calm. It was transparent at the time it was written. Margaret frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Gregory leaned back slightly in his chair. It means that the agreement relies on the accuracy of the financial picture presented when it was signed. Margaret's patience was thinning. That picture hasn't changed. Gregory did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward Veronica. Miss Stanfield, are you suggesting that financial conditions connected to the Harrington structure changed in ways that might affect the agreement? Veronica folded her hands calmly. I'm suggesting that certain financial movements occurred after the marriage that may be relevant. Philip looked at her. What financial movements? Veronica met his gaze. Temporary capital transfers. Philip's expression tightened. Gregory's attention sharpened. Margaret spoke quickly. Those were internal adjustments, nothing unusual. Veronica did not disagree. They may be. Gregory leaned forward slightly. Do you have documentation of these transfers? Veronica opened her laptop. Yes. She turned the screen slightly so Gregory could see. The spreadsheet appeared. Rows of dates, amounts, account references. Gregory stared at the screen for several seconds. Philip leaned closer. Margaret remained still. Gregory spoke quietly. These transfers moved through a joint account, yes, and were used as temporary capital coverage for Harrington investment positions. That appears to be the case. Philip sat back slowly. Those were short-term adjustments, he said. They always returned. Veronica nodded. Yes. Gregory looked thoughtful. Were those transactions documented formally? Philip hesitated. No. Margaret answered quickly. They were family arrangements. Gregory nodded slowly. Family arrangements can still affect legal interpretation if they involve marital funds. Margaret's voice sharpened. They were temporary. Gregory looked directly at her. That may be true. Then he turned back to Veronica. How long have you been tracking these transactions? Approximately 16 months. Margaret stared at her. You were monitoring family financial activity for 16 months. Veronica's voice remained calm. I was documenting activity involving our joint account. Margaret's confidence had not disappeared yet, but the certainty in her posture had shifted. Gregory studied the spreadsheet again. How many transfers are listed here? 11, Gregory nodded. And the total amount, Veronica answered quietly. Just under $2 million. Philip inhaled sharply. Margaret finally leaned forward. That money was never permanently removed. Veronica agreed. Yes. Gregory tapped the laptop screen, but it moved through an account legally connected to both spouses. Margaret looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting that matters? Gregory chose his words carefully. I'm suggesting it could matter. Philip rubbed his forehead. This is getting unnecessarily complicated. Veronica looked at him calmly. It's already complicated. Gregory closed the laptop slowly. Then he looked at Margaret. You may want to reconsider the assumption that the prenup alone determines the outcome of this divorce. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. The agreement is perfectly clear. Gregory nodded. Yes. Then he added quietly, but courts sometimes look beyond agreements when financial conduct contradicts the structure those agreements rely on. Margaret did not respond. Philip looked between them. What exactly are you saying? Gregory answered calmly. I'm saying that the narrative of a simple separation protected entirely by the prenup may not be as simple as we believed. The room fell silent again. Veronica closed her laptop. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. She had simply presented information. Margaret Harrington had entered the meeting believing she controlled the legal terrain. But something subtle had just happened. The conversation had shifted away from certainty toward examination. Gregory Holt looked once more at the folder of emails Veronica had brought. Then he looked at Margaret. For now, he said carefully, we should gather all financial documentation related to the transfers Miss Stanfield has recorded. Margaret's voice was quiet. That won't change the outcome. Gregory did not argue. But he did not agree either, because the structure Margaret trusted was no longer standing alone. It was now surrounded by records, emails, bank transfers, conversations. And those records belonged to Veronica Stanfield. The meeting did not end with raised voices. Margaret Harrington had spent too many years navigating boardrooms and investment negotiations to lose composure in a legal office. Instead, the room settled into something colder, more procedural. Gregory Holt closed the folder containing Veronica's printed emails and rested his hands on the table. Before we continue discussing the terms of separation, he said carefully, I recommend we pause the process temporarily. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. On what basis? Gregory remained calm. On the basis that new financial information has been introduced. Margaret turned toward him fully. There is nothing new about internal family capital adjustments. Gregory nodded once, perhaps not. But when those adjustments move through accounts legally shared by both spouses, they become part of the marital financial picture. Philip exhaled quietly. This is getting blown out of proportion. Veronica said nothing. Gregory glanced toward her. Miss Stanfield, do you have additional documentation beyond the transfers you've already shown? Yes. Margaret's voice sharpened. What kind of documentation? Veronica opened her folder again. This. She removed several printed pages. Not emails this time. Bank statements. Gregory accepted them immediately. Philip leaned closer. Margaret remained perfectly still. Gregory scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. These statements confirm the transfers listed in your spreadsheet, he said. Yes. Gregory looked at the dates carefully. These funds moved through the joint account 11 times over the past 16 months. That's correct. Margaret spoke again. They always returned. Gregory did not dispute that. Yes. The statements show the funds returning. Then he turned another page. But they also show something else. Philip frowned. What? Gregory slid the page slightly toward him. Philip read silently. Veronica had highlighted several entries. not the outgoing transfers, but the incoming returns. Philip's expression changed. "What is this?" he asked. Gregory answered calmly. These returns were not identical to the amounts originally transferred. Margaret leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" Gregory pointed to the numbers. For example, on March 14th, $200,000 left the account. Philip nodded. "Yes." Gregory tapped the line below. On April 2nd, the amount returned was $204,000. Margaret frowned. "That's interest." Gregory looked at her. "Possibly." Philip looked confused. "Why does that matter?" Gregory folded the page carefully, because it suggests the funds were not merely temporary adjustments. He paused. "They may have functioned as short-term capital loans." Margaret's voice remained firm. "They were internal family arrangements." Gregory nodded. "But the financial behavior resembles a lending structure." Philip looked at Veronica. "You tracked this, yes?" Margaret's patience was thinning. "This proves nothing." Gregory did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned to another document Veronica had placed in the folder. "What's this?" he asked. "Conversation notes," Veronica said. Gregory raised an eyebrow. "Notes, yes." Gregory scanned the page. His eyes slowed as he read one particular paragraph. Philip watched him. Margaret noticed the change. "What does it say?" Gregory looked up. "These notes describe a conversation between you and me at a cocktail event 2 months ago." Margaret's expression stiffened. "I speak to many people at events," Gregory read quietly. "Gregory warns that moving personal funds through Philip's account during liquidity coverage could create complications during litigation." He looked at Margaret. "Do you remember that conversation?" Margaret hesitated. "I may have said something like that." Gregory continued reading. Margaret replies, "The prenup ensures that structure remains protected." The words hung in the room. Philip looked at his mother. Margaret's composure remained mostly intact. "Those were private comments," she said. Veronica spoke quietly. "I wasn't part of the conversation." Margaret turned sharply. "Then how did you hear it?" Veronica answered calmly. "I was standing on the balcony." Gregory closed the notes slowly. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Margaret." His tone was careful. "Given this information, we need to consider the possibility that certain financial actions may be interpreted as blending personal and marital funds." Margaret stared at him. "You're overanalyzing." Gregory shook his head slightly. "I'm doing my job." Philip rubbed his forehead again. "This is ridiculous." Veronica looked at him gently. "I didn't create the transactions." Philip did not respond. Gregory turned another page of the bank statements. These incoming returns also originated from accounts tied to Harrington Capital subsidiaries. Margaret's voice was quiet. "Of course they did." Gregory nodded. "But the path those funds took matters." Philip looked at him. "Why?" Gregory answered carefully. "Because if marital accounts were used repeatedly to stabilize investment structures without formal documentation, it may complicate the financial separation defined by the prenup." Margaret's confidence finally showed its first visible fracture. "You're suggesting this changes everything." Gregory did not say yes. He did not say no. Instead, he said, "I'm suggesting we need a complete financial reconstruction before making that assumption." The phrase hung heavily in the room. Financial reconstruction. Philip leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Veronica remained quiet. Margaret looked directly at Gregory. "How long would that process take?" "Several weeks," Gregory said. "Perhaps longer." Margaret exhaled slowly. This divorce was supposed to be simple. Gregory answered calmly, "It may still be." Then he looked briefly at Veronica. "But the situation is no longer as simple as we believed." Veronica closed her folder. She had not argued. She had not accused Margaret of manipulation. She had not even suggested that anyone had acted dishonestly. She had simply placed the structure of events on the table. Dates, transfers, emails, conversations. And the structure Margaret trusted so completely had begun revealing its weaknesses. Gregory stood up slowly. I recommend we adjourn for today. Margaret remained seated. Philip stood reluctantly. Veronica gathered her documents quietly. As they prepared to leave the room, Margaret finally spoke again. Her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. This doesn't mean you're entitled to Harrington assets. Veronica looked at her. I haven't claimed anything. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. But you're building a case. Veronica paused for a moment. Then she answered calmly, I'm documenting the truth. Margaret did not reply, because for the first time since the divorce conversation began, the truth had stopped behaving the way she expected. And Gregory Holt, the lawyer who had written the prenup she trusted so completely, now understood why. For several days after the meeting in Gregory Holt's office, the Harrington family remained unusually quiet. There were no immediate legal filings, no announcements, no sudden confrontations. Instead, the situation moved into the slower rhythm that complicated financial disputes often followed. Documentation, reconstruction, verification. Gregory Holt had requested full financial records related to every transfer Veronica Stanfield had documented. Harrington Capital's internal accounting team began compiling statements, transaction histories, and internal memos connected to the liquidity coverage Margaret had arranged. Philip spent long hours at the townhouse, reviewing files with Gregory and Charles. Margaret remained outwardly composed, but something about the household had shifted. For the first time in many years, the structure she believed she controlled had become subject to examination. And Margaret Harrington did not enjoy being examined. Veronica, meanwhile, returned to her ordinary routine. She went to work. She attended meetings. She prepared reports for clients who had no connection to the Harrington family at all. Her colleagues noticed nothing unusual. Even Olivia Chen, who had once joked about Veronica solving something, saw only the same calm analyst she had always known. But each evening, Veronica reviewed updates Daniel Reeves sent regarding the legal process. The financial reconstruction Gregory had initiated was revealing details no one in the Harrington household had expected to discuss. Several of the transfers Veronica documented had indeed been used to stabilize liquidity gaps inside the Harrington real estate fund. Others had temporarily covered investor withdrawals during a period of market uncertainty. In every case, the money had eventually returned. But the path those funds had taken through personal accounts connected to Philip, and therefore legally connected to Veronica, had complicated the narrative Margaret had relied upon. Daniel summarized the situation during one phone call. The prenup still protects Harrington family assets, he explained. Veronica listened quietly, but she asked. Daniel sighed softly, but the repeated use of marital accounts for operational liquidity support creates questions about financial commingling. Meaning the clean separation Margaret assumed might not be as clean as she believed. Veronica thanked him and ended the call. She did not celebrate. She did not even feel surprised. Everything unfolding now had been visible in the pattern months earlier. Meanwhile, inside the Harrington townhouse, the reconstruction process had begun to produce uncomfortable conversations. One afternoon, Gregory sat across from Margaret and Charles in the library. Stacks of documents lay across the table. Bank statements, internal accounting summaries, transfer confirmations. Gregory removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The problem isn't the transfers themselves, he said quietly. Margaret sat perfectly still. I've said that repeatedly. Gregory nodded. Yes, but the documentation surrounding them is inconsistent. Charles finally spoke. In what way? Gregory slid a page across the table. This transfer, $200,000, originated from Philip's joint account. Margaret nodded. It returned. Yes, Gregory said. But during the period it was gone, it was recorded internally as temporary investor liquidity coverage. Margaret frowned. So Gregory looked at her carefully. That means the funds functioned as operational capital. Margaret's voice remained firm, temporarily. Gregory leaned back. The court may still interpret that as commingling. Charles frowned slightly. But the funds returned. Yes, Gregory paused before continuing. But once funds cross certain legal boundaries, returning them does not always restore the original separation. Margaret's expression hardened. You're telling me Veronica could claim Harrington assets? Gregory shook his head. No. Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly. But Gregory added, the divorce settlement may no longer follow the exact structure defined in the prenup. Silence settled in the library. Margaret had built her confidence on one belief, that the prenup guaranteed control. Now Gregory was explaining something else. The agreement still mattered, but it was no longer the only factor. Later that evening, Philip returned to the apartment. Veronica was sitting near the window, with her laptop closed beside her. The summer sunset cast warm light across the river outside. Philip stood quietly in the doorway for a moment before speaking. I spoke with Gregory today. Veronica looked up. I assumed you would. Philip walked slowly toward the kitchen. He says the settlement might be different than we expected. Veronica nodded once. Philip poured himself water. You planned this. Veronica shook her head. No, you documented everything. Yes. Philip studied her carefully. Why Veronica considered the question? Because documentation protects the truth. Philip leaned against the counter. You knew the prenup might not work the way my mother believed. I knew it depended on honesty. Philip looked out the window. My mother thought you would fight emotionally. Veronica said nothing. Philip turned back toward her. You never did. No? Philip nodded slowly. That confused her. Veronica's voice remained quiet. I wasn't trying to confuse anyone. Philip exhaled softly. She said something else today. Veronica waited. She said you were calculating. Veronica did not appear offended. I'm careful. Philip studied her face again. You never hated my family. No. You never even argued with my mother. Veronica shook her head. There was no reason to. Philip looked down at the floor. I think she underestimated you. Veronica did not respond. Because Margaret Harrington had not simply underestimated her. Margaret had misunderstood something fundamental. She believed power came from controlling the structure, from writing the agreements, from defining the rules. But Veronica Stanfield understood a different truth. Structures only worked as long as the people inside them followed the rules honestly. And when they didn't, documentation quietly changed everything. 2 weeks later, Gregory Holt finalized the preliminary settlement framework. The result was not dramatic. Veronica did not receive Harrington Capital shares. She did not claim family trust assets. Those protections remained intact. But the settlement did something Margaret had once declared impossible. It acknowledged the financial role the marital account had played during the liquidity coverage period. And, because of that involvement, Veronica was entitled to a negotiated financial settlement that Margaret had believed the prenup made impossible. It was not revenge. It was not victory. It was simply the legal outcome of a structure examined carefully. When Margaret read the settlement proposal, she said very little. But the certainty she once carried was gone, because the agreement she had trusted had not protected her the way she expected. Not because the prenup had failed, but because the reality surrounding it had been more complicated than she had admitted. And Veronica Stanfield had quietly documented every detail. The final settlement did not arrive with the kind of dramatic confrontation people often imagined when marriages ended. There was no courtroom spectacle, no raised voices, no public accusations. Instead, the outcome unfolded in a quiet conference room 3 weeks after Gregory Holt completed the financial reconstruction. The same room where Margaret Harrington had once spoken with absolute certainty. The same room where she had declared that Veronica Stanfield would leave with nothing. This time, the atmosphere was different. The long oak table held only a few documents. Gregory Holt sat near the center of the room. Philip Harrington sat beside him, his posture tired but composed. Margaret Harrington arrived last. She carried herself with the same elegance she had maintained for decades, but the sharp confidence that once defined her presence had softened. Veronica Stanfield entered quietly and took her seat across from them. Daniel Reeves sat beside her. Gregory adjusted his glasses and opened the settlement document. "Thank you for coming," he said calmly. "This meeting will finalize the terms agreed upon following the financial review." Margaret did not interrupt. Philip looked down at the table. Gregory continued. "The prenuptial agreement remains valid and enforceable regarding Harrington family assets, trust holdings, and corporate ownership structures." Margaret nodded slightly. That part of the agreement had never truly been in danger. Gregory turned the page. However, the review of financial activity over the course of the marriage identified repeated transfers involving marital accounts used to support temporary liquidity obligations connected to Harrington Capital. Margaret remained silent. Gregory continued reading. "As a result, the settlement recognizes that marital funds participated indirectly in the stabilization of those financial structures." Daniel Reeves nodded slightly. Gregory looked at Veronica briefly before continuing. "Because of that involvement, the settlement includes a financial resolution acknowledging Veronica Stanfield's participation in those transactions." Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was calm but quieter than it had been during the first meeting. "The amount is excessive." Daniel answered before Veronica could. "The amount reflects the documented financial exposure." Margaret looked at Gregory. "You agree with this?" Gregory's tone remained neutral. "It reflects the legal interpretation of the documentation presented." Philip finally looked up. "Mom." Margaret said nothing. Gregory placed the final page on the table. "The settlement does not alter the structure of Harrington Capital. It does not grant ownership of family trusts or corporate assets." He paused, but it recognized the financial participation of the marital account and resolves the matter accordingly. The room fell silent. Margaret looked at Veronica. For the first time since the divorce discussions began, she did not speak with authority. Instead, she asked a question. "Why did you keep all of those records?" Veronica considered the question calmly. "Because the truth is easier to understand when it's written down." Margaret held her gaze. "You knew the prenup wouldn't protect us completely." Veronica shook her head. "No." Margaret frowned. "Then what did you know?" Veronica answered quietly. "I knew the agreement depended on honesty." Margaret did not respond, because she understood the meaning behind the sentence. Gregory slid the documents forward. "If everyone agrees, we can sign." Philip picked up the pen first. His signature was steady. When he finished, he pushed the document toward Veronica. She signed without hesitation. Then Gregory handed the pen to Margaret. Margaret studied the document for several seconds. For most of her life, she had believed power meant controlling the outcome before anyone else understood the situation. But the structure she trusted had revealed something unexpected. Control was not always the same thing as certainty. Margaret signed the document slowly. Gregory collected the papers. "The matter is resolved," he said. The meeting ended without ceremony. Philip stood quietly. Veronica gathered her folder. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer before rising. As Veronica walked toward the door, Margaret spoke once more. "Veronica." She turned. Margaret studied her carefully. "You never tried to humiliate this family." "No, you could have." Veronica considered the statement. "I wasn't interested in that." Margaret nodded slowly. "Most people would have been." Veronica said nothing. Because revenge had never been the point. The point had been clarity. Margaret exhaled quietly. "I misjudged you." Veronica did not respond. Some acknowledgments did not require answers. Outside the building, the late afternoon air carried the warmth of early autumn. Veronica walked several blocks before stopping near the edge of Central Park. The city moved around her with its usual rhythm. Taxis, footsteps, voices, life continuing without pause. Her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel Reeves. It read simply, "Everything finalized." Veronica placed the phone back in her bag. For the first time in several years, the structure surrounding her life felt quiet again. Not victorious, just clear. She had not destroyed the Harrington family. She had not taken anything that did not belong to her. She had simply allowed the truth to appear in the place where it mattered most. On paper. And when truth appears clearly enough, even the strongest structures must adjust. Veronica Stanfield walked slowly along the park path, leaving the legal offices behind her. She did not look back. Some endings did not need witnesses. They only needed dignity. The story of Veronica Stanfield does not end with a dramatic victory. It ends with something quieter. For years, Margaret Harrington believed power came from writing the rules before anyone else could question them. She trusted contracts' influence and the confidence that wealth often brings. What she did not expect was someone who respected those rules enough to read them carefully. Veronica never argued loudly. She never tried to embarrass anyone. She never needed to raise her voice. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She watched. She recorded. She waited. In a world where people often react quickly to injustice, Veronica chose patience. She understood that truth has a way of revealing itself when the details are preserved. Not through anger, through clarity. And in the end, that quiet discipline changed the entire outcome. If this story left you thinking about the difference between power and integrity, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from today? What time is it in your part of the world? Sometimes the most powerful stories come from ordinary moments handled with quiet strength. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about patience, justice, and dignity, consider subscribing to the channel. No pressure, just an invitation to continue exploring stories where silence speaks louder than anger, and where the truth written carefully enough always finds its place.